Hello and welcome to my Bourbon News podcast. Thanks for joining me. This is Ed from BourbonObsessed.com, also known as Bourbon_Obsessed on Instagram. I hope everybody's had a great week. I did an interesting thing this past Wednesday. I was invited down to Garrard County Distilling in Lancaster, Kentucky. It's a new distillery on the scene, first starting production in January of this year. They currently make all nations bourbon, but they have a huge operation and a very large capacity, so there will be quite a bit coming out of them in the future. They're gearing up now to get ready to welcome visitors, so it'll definitely be one that you want to check out. Stay tuned for a full write-up about them on BourbonObsessed.com, as well as pictures and video on Instagram and Facebook. Before we get into the news, let's start with a few highlights from BourbonObsessed.com. We did a few reviews this past week. The first is Lasso Motel Whiskey. They burst onto the scene with a whole bunch of finished and unfinished whiskeys a couple of months ago. The brand was founded by drinks industry veteran Devin Odell, who's president of Dynasty Spirits. Devin wanted to add a high-end bourbon line to his portfolio, and thus this brand was born. This past week, we reviewed two of the straight bourbons. Both were quite good and at a reasonable price point. They are the Lasso Motel 8-year Kentucky Straight Whiskey and the Lasso Motel 4-year Kentucky Straight Whiskey. They come from Barton's 1792 and Green River Distilling, respectively. While they are both labeled whiskey on the label, I believe them to be bourbons. Next up was Four Branches Bourbon. Four Branches is the only spirits company founded by veterans of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. The founders blend and bottle their bourbon at the Bardstown Bourbon Company. I had the opportunity to sit down with them there, try their bourbon, and learn more about the brand and their story. They were also featured on the Today Show this past week, so you may have seen them there. A portion of their profits are donated to nonprofit organizations which support veterans and first responders. In their first year and a half of operation, they have already donated over $400,000 to these organizations. And their bourbon is really good, too. Finally, Lux Road Distillers have expanded their bourbon line with their new bourbon finished in PX sherry casks. My friend Ray Marcano enjoyed this bourbon and reviewed it in his newsletter and on BourbonObsessed.com. As usual, you can find these full reviews on the website for your reading pleasure. While we're on the topic of the website, if you would like to help support this podcast, my newsletter, and my website, just head on over to BourbonObsessed.com and follow the links to Buy Me a Coffee. I really appreciate it. Now we'll get on to the news. There are a few news stories this week, but there are quite a few bourbon releases, and we'll try to get through them all. First, Maker's Mark has a new master distiller. The distillery has named Dr. Blake Layfield as the brand's next master distiller. In this role, Dr. Layfield will oversee the consistency and taste vision of Maker's Mark bourbon, as well as new product innovation. In addition, he'll advance the many environmental and agricultural initiatives on Star Hill Farm, which is the property that Maker's Mark Distillery is on. His previous position was Senior Director of Innovation, Blending, and Quality for Maker's Mark. Fire and Flask Distillery debuted their first bourbon at a release party this week. They're described as the only production purple corn bourbon on the market. Their bourbon is distilled and sold at Second Sight Spirits, which is in Ludlow, Kentucky. Evan Williams announced 15 recipients of the American-Made Heroes Foundation Fund Grants. The 2024 Veteran Community Action Grants awarded $75,000 across projects which make a meaningful difference in the enjoyment and quality of life for veterans across America. From training service dogs to mental health care and adaptive sports, each program supports giving back to those who served. You can read all the details and the list of recipients over on BourbonObsessed.com. Finally, Four Roses announced the Single Barrel Collection. The first release will feature 3 new 100 proof single barrel bourbons. They will come from recipes OBSF, OESK, and OESO. The collection will also include the currently available 100 proof single barrel bourbon, OBSV. Each bottle is aged 7 to 9 years, and every year, 3 different recipes will be featured. OBSV will always be in the lineup, but the others will rotate. These new single-barrel bourbons will be available starting in early 2025 for a cost of around $50 a bottle. Now we'll move on to the many new releases. Old Commonwealth Distillery's second release, called Kentucky Nectar, is a double-barreled, cask-strength, wheated Kentucky straight bourbon that's been finished in honey casks. It's bottled at 106 proof and is available for around $100. It can be purchased through their website. LeGrand Spirits, the company co-founded by Eric LeGrand, who was the college football player who suffered a serious spinal cord injury a number of years ago, and Brian Axelrod, expands its portfolio with a limited edition bourbon, Eric LeGrand Single Barrel Bourbon. This is the company's first single barrel bourbon and first limited edition release since the company debuted its first bourbon in March 2023. Notably, $5.20 of every case sold is donated to the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, supporting those living with and impacted by paralysis by finding the cure for spinal cord injuries. My full review is coming soon to bourbonobsessed.com. It is bottled at 104 proof and priced at around $60. The James B. Beam Distillery has really been on a roll lately with limited releases. The latest is the Old Grandad 16-year-old bourbon. Here's the description from the brand. This limited 2024 one-time only Old Grandad expression is aged a minimum of 16 years and pays homage to the brand's legacy as one of the industry's preeminent whiskeys of its time. Historically inspired by vintage releases, this bourbon is cut to 100 proof to reach its optimal and distinctively classic OGD flavor and body. It's bottled at 100 proof and priced at around $195. Ross and Squibb Distillery, formerly known as MGP, announced the Remus Gatsby Reserve 2024 edition. This year's edition is made with 15-year-old reserves, featuring 2 signature mash bills said to be inspired by the Roaring Twenties and the time of Gatsby. It should be available now, and it's bottled at 104.9 proof and priced at $230. Angel's Envy announced its 13th annual cask-strength Kentucky Straight Bourbon whiskey finished in port barrels. This year's release offers a new spin on the traditional annual release by introducing a tawny port wine finish blended with the traditional ruby port wine finish. It'll be available starting in December at retailers. However, it will be available at the distillery beginning November 21st at 9 a.m. It's bottled at 118.8 proof and priced at $230. I'm very excited about this one because I'll be going to a media event tomorrow where we'll have the opportunity to taste it and learn all about it from master distiller Owen Martin. The World Whiskey Society released the Wyatt Earp 13-year-old American Whiskey Hazmat Edition. Bottled at an extraordinary 160 proof, this limited edition cask-strength whiskey adds a bold new layer to World Whiskey Society's portfolio. It's now available online and nationally in select retailers. Bottled at 160 proof and priced at $249. The A. Smith Bowman Distillery announced the release of Abraham Bowman Oak Series American Oak. It's the second experimental whiskey to debut from their Abraham Bowman Oak Series. This 12-year-old limited edition bourbon whiskey will be available to order via an online lottery, which can be entered from November 25 through December 2nd. It's bottled at 135 proof and priced at around $80. Finally, 10-Day Bourbon introduces Surgeon's Cut. It's an 8-year-old limited release Kentucky Straight Bourbon whiskey. Surgeon's Cut is available in Kentucky in limited quantities at select Liquor Barn locations, as well as at Justin's House of Bourbon. Select online sales will also be available through Bourbon Outfitter. It's bottled at 110 proof, and the price is not currently provided. I'm supposed to be receiving a sample of this bourbon soon, so should have a review of it in a few weeks. Well, that's it for this week's news. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. The press releases for these whiskeys and news stories, as well as many bourbon reviews, can be found on bourbonobsessed.com. Be sure to check them out. Also, I'd be honored if you would follow me on Instagram at bourbon_obsessed. I'm the one with the blue check mark, and on Facebook, where I am simply Bourbon Obsessed. See you next time. Cheers.